The blood-soaked bandana fluttered in the relentless Arizona wind as Bryce Jameson staggered through the dusty streets of Springerville, his raw, torn hands throbbing with each labored heartbeat. The year was 1878, and the frontier town had seen its share of broken men, but few as stubbornly proud as this one. Bryce kept his head down as he passed the saloon, ignoring the raucous laughter spilling from its swinging doors. 3 days ago, he'd been inside, playing cards with a stranger who'd accused him of cheating. The ensuing fight had left the stranger with a broken jaw and Bryce with hands so damaged he could barely grip the reins of his horse. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dirt road as he made his way toward Doc Sullivan's place at the edge of town. The physician had patched him up before, but Bryce had no money to pay him this time. The cattle drive that had brought him to Springerville had ended with most of his earnings lost in that ill-fated poker game, leaving just enough for a room at the boarding house and feed for his horse. As he approached the doctor's house, he noticed the lantern wasn't lit. A hastily scrawled note hung on the door. "Gone to Holbrook. Emergency. Back in 3 days." Bryce swore under his breath. The pain was becoming unbearable. The skin split across his knuckles, dried blood mixing with the dust of the trail. Infection was a cowboy's worst enemy next to a bullet, and he could already feel the dangerous heat radiating from his wounds. "You need help with those hands." The voice came from behind him, soft but firm. He turned slowly, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain up his arms. Delilah O'Brien stood on the bottom step of the doctor's porch, a basket of supplies in her arms. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her blue calico dress dusty at the hem from the unpaved streets. "Doc Sullivan isn't here," Bryce stated unnecessarily, his voice gruff from thirst and exhaustion. "I know. I'm his assistant." Her eyes moved to his poorly bandaged hands. "Those need cleaning. Properly." Bryce hesitated. He'd seen her around town since arriving with the cattle drive 2 weeks ago. She was the schoolteacher, he recalled, but apparently helped the doctor in her spare time. Unmarried, based on the absence of a ring, but respected in town. Despite her youth, she couldn't be more than 25. "I've got no money," he admitted, hating the words as they left his mouth. Delilah's expression didn't change. "I didn't ask for any. Come inside, I have the key." Too tired and in too much pain to argue, Bryce followed her into the small office that doubled as Doc Sullivan's practice. She lit a lamp and set her basket down, then filled a basin with water from a pitcher. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to a wooden chair near the examination table. He obeyed, removing his hat with painful awkwardness and placing it on his knee. She worked methodically, gathering supplies from the doctor's cabinets, clean bandages, a bottle of amber liquid, a jar of ointment. "I need to see them," she said, nodding toward his hands. Slowly, he unwrapped the filthy bandana from his right hand, then his left, revealing the raw, split skin beneath. The knuckles were swollen to twice their normal size, the flesh torn from striking both bone and wood during the brawl. Delilah inhaled sharply, but said nothing. She soaked a cloth in the water and gently took his right hand in hers. When she began cleaning the wounds, Bryce clenched his jaw to keep from making a sound. "You did this fighting," she stated, rather than asked as she worked. Bryce didn't respond. The cool water provided momentary relief, but when she poured a small amount of the amber liquid over his knuckles, he couldn't suppress a hiss of pain. "Whiskey," she explained, her tone professional. "Best disinfectant we have." They fell into silence as she continued her work, cleaning both hands with painstaking care. When she finally reached for the jar of ointment, Bryce's hands felt as though they had been dipped in fire. "This will help with healing," she said, unscrewing the lid to reveal a thick herbal-smelling paste. "It's my own mixture, calendula, comfrey, and honey." Her fingers were cool as she began to apply the ointment, working it gently into the damaged skin. Though the touch was painful, there was something uncommonly tender in the way she handled his brutalized hands, as if they were worth saving, worth treating with care despite the violence that had damaged them. The silence between them stretched. broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as she shifted her weight. Outside, the last light of day faded into the purplish hue of dusk, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the emerging stars. "You're new to Springerville," she said finally. Her eyes focused on his left hand as she spread the ointment across his knuckles. "Just passing through," Bryce replied. "Was heading north with the cattle drive. Thought I'd stay a few days before moving on." "Where to?" He shrugged. "Wherever there's work." Delilah nodded, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "These will need daily care for at least a week," she said, beginning to wrap clean bandages around his right hand. "Otherwise, they'll scar badly, maybe get infected. You could lose the use of your fingers." The thought sent a chill through him. A cowboy with crippled hands was no cowboy at all. "I'll be fine," he lied. She looked up then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. Hers were a clear, steady blue that reminded him of mountain lakes he'd seen in Colorado. "No, you won't," she said simply. "You need help. And since Doc Sullivan is away, that help will have to come from me." There was something in her voice that brooked no argument, a certainty that seemed out of place in someone so young. She finished bandaging his left hand and stepped back, surveying her work. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll be here before school starts." Bryce stood, awkwardly placing his hat on his head with his bandaged hands. "Thank you," he said stiffly. "I'm Bryce Jameson." "Delilah O'Brien," she replied, though he already knew her name from town gossip. He nodded once and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "I'll pay you back," he said, his back still to her, "once I can work again." "Just make sure these heal properly," she answered. "That's payment enough." As Bryce walked back to his room at the boarding house, the cool night air of Springerville settling around him, he found himself replaying the feeling of her gentle hands working the soothing ointment into his wounds. It had been a long time since anyone had touched him with such care. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sky a vast expanse of uninterrupted blue. Bryce woke early, the pain in his hands having kept his sleep shallow. The bandages Delilah had applied were still clean and tight, but the throbbing had intensified overnight. He made his way back to the doctor's office just as the sun was cresting the distant mountains. Delilah was already there, her hair neatly braided, wearing a simple green dress with an apron over it. "You came," she said, opening the door wider to let him in. There was a hint of surprise in her voice. "Said I would," he replied, stepping past her into the room that smelled of medicinal herbs and clean linen. "Most men who say they will often don't," she remarked, closing the door behind him. Bryce didn't have a response for that. In his experience, she wasn't wrong. The morning routine established itself quickly. He sat in the same chair as the night before, and she unwrapped his bandages with careful fingers, examining the wounds in the clear morning light. "Better than I expected," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "The swelling's down a little." She cleaned his hands again, the process no less painful than before, but somehow easier to bear with the soft morning light filtering through the windows and the birds singing outside. "How did it happen?" she asked as she worked, not looking up from his hands. Bryce hesitated. The story didn't paint him in a favorable light. "Disagreement over a card game," he finally said. "Must have been some disagreement. He accused me of cheating. I wasn't." She nodded, reaching for the jar of ointment. "And instead of walking away, you fought." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "A man's reputation means something out here." Her fingers paused momentarily in their work. "Yes, I suppose it does," she agreed quietly. "Though sometimes I wonder if men value the wrong things when it comes to reputation." The ointment was cool against his hot skin as she began to massage it into his wounds. This time, Bryce watched her face as she worked, noticing the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she caught her lower lip between her teeth when she encountered a particularly difficult area. "You're not from around here originally," he observed. She glanced up briefly. "Boston. My father was a doctor there." "Long way from home." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Home is where you make it, Mr. Jameson." "Bryce," he corrected. Bryce, she repeated, and somehow the sound of his name in her voice made something shift in his chest. How did you end up in Springerville? He asked, wincing slightly as she applied more pressure to a particularly tender spot. My parents died in a typhoid outbreak 5 years ago. I had an aunt in Tucson, so I came west. Trained as a teacher in Boston, so when I heard Springerville needed someone to teach the children, I applied. She began wrapping fresh bandages around his right hand. Been here 3 years now. Started helping Doc Sullivan about a year ago when I realized how overworked he was. You like it here? After Boston? Delilah finished with his right hand and moved to his left, her touch still gentle despite the growing strength in her movements as she became more comfortable with him. It's different, she said thoughtfully. Harder in some ways, simpler in others. The people are good, mostly. The children eager to learn. She paused, then added, and there's a kind of beauty to the land that gets under your skin, the vastness of it. Bryce nodded. He understood that feeling well, though he'd never put it into words as she had. What about you? She asked. Where are you from originally? Texas, he answered, near San Antonio. Left when I was 16. Been moving ever since. Family? None living. She nodded, not offering the typical platitudes of sympathy that usually followed such a statement, for which he was grateful. There, she said, securing the last bandage, all done for now. Come back this evening after school lets out and I'll change them again. Bryce stood, flexing his fingers carefully within the confines of the bandages. They felt better, though still painfully stiff. Thank you, he said, meaning it. What do I owe you? Delilah shook her head. Nothing. Just taking care of my neighbor as the good book says we should. He nodded, uncertain how to respond to such generosity. I'll see you this evening then. As he stepped out into the bright morning, he realized that for the first time in years he had a reason to look forward to the end of the day. The pattern continued for 3 days. Mornings before school and evenings after, Bryce would make his way to Doc Sullivan's office where Delilah waited with her basin of clean water, her whiskey disinfectant, and her jar of healing ointment. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, their conversations gradually expanding beyond the immediate concerns of his injury. He learned that she loved poetry and had brought a small collection of books with her from Boston. She had a younger brother who'd moved to San Francisco and wrote in frequently. Her favorite time of day was dawn, when the desert came alive with colors most people never saw. In turn, he found himself telling her about the places he'd been in his years of wandering, the vast grasslands of the Dakota Territory, the towering mountains of Colorado, the humid bayous of Louisiana. He told her about the best horse he'd ever owned, a roan gelding named Captain that had carried him through a blizzard in Wyoming and died the following spring from a rattlesnake bite. On the 4th day, Doc Sullivan returned. Bryce arrived for his morning treatment to find the older man examining his notes at the desk, while Delilah prepared the usual supplies. So you're the cowboy who's been keeping Miss O'Brien busy, the doctor said, looking up from his papers. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were sharp as they assessed Bryce from head to toe. Yes, sir, Bryce replied, removing his hat. Appreciate her help while you were away. Doc Sullivan rose and approached, gesturing for Bryce to take a seat. Let's have a look at those hands, then. Delilah stepped back as the doctor took over, unwrapping the bandages with practiced efficiency. His touch was competent, but lacked the gentle care Bryce had grown accustomed to from Delilah. Healing nicely, Doc Sullivan pronounced after his examination. Miss O'Brien did a fine job. That ointment of hers works wonders. Thank you, Doctor, Delilah said, a hint of pride in her voice. You should be able to use them normally in another week or so, the doctor told Bryce. Just don't get into any more fights. No, sir, I don't plan to. Doc Sullivan rewrapped the bandages, then turned to wash his hands in the basin. Miss O'Brien, I can take over from here if you'd like to prepare for your school day. Bryce felt a surprising pang of disappointment, which must have shown on his face because Delilah quickly spoke up. Actually, Doctor, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue Mr. Jameson's treatment, for consistency's sake. I have time before school starts. The doctor glanced between them, a knowing look crossing his weathered face. As you wish. Just don't be late for your students. After he left the room, a slightly awkward silence fell between them. You didn't have to do that, Bryce said finally. Delilah busied herself with the ointment jar. I started your treatment. I'd like to see it through. She looked up at him, a hint of color in her cheeks. If that's all right with you. More than all right, he admitted. Her smile was small but genuine as she took his hands in hers once more. That evening, when Bryce returned for his treatment, Doc Sullivan was out on another call. Delilah worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before speaking. How long will you stay in Springerville? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Bryce hadn't given it much thought in recent days. Originally, he'd planned to move on as soon as he could work again, following the familiar pattern of his drifting life. Not sure, he answered honestly. Depends on if I can find work. Delilah nodded, focused intently on applying the ointment to a particularly stubborn cut across his palm. The Hendersons are looking for help with their ranch, she said casually. Mr. Henderson broke his leg last month, and they're struggling to keep up with everything. Bryce studied her downturned face, wondering if there was more behind the suggestion than simple information. Might be worth looking into, he said, once my hands are better. They're good people, she continued, fair employers. Their place is about 5 miles east of town. The thought of staying in one place longer than a few weeks was foreign to Bryce. He'd spent so many years moving from job to job, town to town, that the idea of putting down even temporary roots felt strange. And yet, as he watched Delilah's careful ministrations to his wounded hands, something about the prospect didn't seem as uncomfortable as it once might have. Maybe I'll ride out there tomorrow, he said, just to talk to them. She looked up then, her eyes bright. That would be sensible, she agreed, a little too quickly. Practical. As she finished wrapping his hands, their fingers brushed, and for a moment neither pulled away. The touch was barely there, the briefest contact, but something electric passed between them, an awareness that transcended the clinical nature of their previous interactions. Delilah was the first to step back, a flush rising to her cheeks as she busied herself with tidying the supplies. Same time tomorrow morning? She asked, her voice slightly higher than usual. I'll be here, Bryce promised. The next day, after his morning treatment, Bryce rode out to the Henderson ranch as suggested. The place was modest but well kept, with a sturdy main house, a bunkhouse for workers, and several outbuildings. A large corral held a dozen horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the sparse but nutritious grasses of the high desert. Thomas Henderson was a man in his 50s with a thatch of gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. His broken leg was propped up on a chair on the porch as Bryce approached. Mr. Henderson? Bryce called, dismounting carefully with his bandaged hands. That's me, the rancher replied, squinting against the sun. What can I do for you, young man? Name's Bryce Jameson. Heard you might be looking for help around the place. Henderson's gaze went straight to Bryce's bandaged hands. Looks like you might need more help than me at the moment. Bryce had anticipated the concern. Healing well. Doc says I'll be fit for work in a week or so. Thought I'd check if the position might still be available then. The older man studied him for a long moment. Who told you I was hiring? Miss O'Brien, the schoolteacher. At this, Henderson's face softened. Ah, Delilah. Good woman, that one. Helped my wife through pneumonia last winter. He shifted in his chair, wincing as he jostled his injured leg. You know anything about cattle, Mr. Jameson? Grew up on a ranch in Texas. Been working cattle drives the past 8 years. This seemed to satisfy Henderson. They spoke for almost an hour about the ranch, the work required, and the terms of employment. By the time Bryce mounted his horse to leave, he had secured a job starting the following week, with room and board in the bunkhouse and fair wages. As he rode back toward town, he felt a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. For the first time in years, he had a reason to stay somewhere, at least for a while. The fact that Delilah O'Brien's presence in Springerville was a significant part of that reason was something he wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. When he arrived for his evening treatment, Delilah was waiting, her expression expectant. "I got the job," he said simply as she began unwrapping his bandages. The smile that bloomed across her face made his heart stutter in his chest. "That's wonderful news, Bryce. When do you start?" "Next week. Henderson seems like a decent man." "He is. His wife Martha brings me fresh eggs sometimes, and they're always at church on Sundays." She paused, her fingers gentle against his healing skin. "So you'll be staying in Springerville for a while then?" It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Looks that way." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was something building between them, fragile and undefined, but undeniably real. "I'm glad," she finally said, her voice soft. "So am I," he replied, surprised to discover how true the words were. The next few days followed the same pattern, but with a new undercurrent of awareness between them. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Bryce found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years about his childhood in Texas, the death of his parents from fever when he was 15, his decision to leave home rather than be placed with distant relatives who saw him as free labor and nothing more. In turn, Delilah spoke of her life in Boston, the strictness of her upbringing tempered by her father's love of learning, which he had passed on to her. She described the shock of losing both parents within days of each other and the long journey west to a life she could never have imagined as a girl. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Bryce asked one morning as she applied the ointment to his now rapidly healing hands. Delilah considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "It was difficult at first. The harshness of the land, the isolation. But there's a freedom here that I never knew in Boston. A chance to define myself by my own actions rather than by my family's position or society's expectations." Bryce nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's why I kept moving," he admitted. "Each new place was a clean slate. No one knew me. No one had expectations." "And yet, now you're staying," she observed, her eyes on her work. "Maybe it's time to stop running from expectations and start building some worth having." Her hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle ministrations. "That's a wise perspective, Bryce." "Not wise," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Just tired, maybe. Tired of having nothing and no one to come back to." Delilah finished wrapping his hands and stepped back, her eyes meeting his directly. "Well," she said quietly, "now you have somewhere to come back to, at least for a while." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. On the morning Bryce was to begin work at the Henderson Ranch, he arrived at the doctor's office earlier than usual. His hands were nearly healed, the skin pink but no longer raw, the swelling completely gone. He could flex his fingers normally, though there was still some stiffness in the joints. Delilah examined them with professional satisfaction. "Remarkable healing," she pronounced. "You were fortunate there was no serious infection." "Fortunate to have had a skilled healer," Bryce corrected. She smiled at the compliment, reaching for her jar of ointment one last time. "This should be the last application needed," she said, a note of something like regret in her voice. "Just be careful for another week or so. No roping cattle or breaking horses if you can avoid it." "Yes, madam," he agreed, watching her face as she worked. When she finished, she didn't immediately wrap his hands again. Instead, she looked up at him, her blue eyes serious. "Will I see you in town, now that you won't need treatments anymore?" The question was carefully casual, but Bryce could hear the uncertainty beneath it. "I was thinking I might attend church on Sunday," he said, "if that would be appropriate." Her face brightened. "Very appropriate. Services start at 10. "And perhaps," he continued, finding courage he didn't know he possessed, "you might consider allowing me to escort you to dinner afterward, at the hotel restaurant." A blush rose to Delilah's cheeks, but her smile was steady. "I would like that very much, Bryce." He left the doctor's office that morning feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the hard work awaiting him at the ranch. The prospect of Sunday of seeing Delilah in a context that had nothing to do with his injuries filled him with an anticipation that made the days seem long. Life at the Henderson Ranch quickly fell into a comfortable routine. The work was hard but satisfying, and Thomas Henderson proved to be a fair employer who respected Bryce's experience with cattle. The other ranch hands, two young brothers named Ellis and a middle-aged Mexican man called Manuel, were skilled workers who accepted Bryce without question once they saw he could pull his weight. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Bryce woke before dawn, shaved carefully, and put on the one good shirt he owned, freshly washed and pressed by Mrs. Henderson, who had taken a motherly interest in him after learning he had no family. He rode into town with plenty of time to spare, tying his horse outside the small wooden church that served as the heart of Springerville's community. People were already gathering, families in their Sunday best, greeting each other with warmth that spoke of long-established connections. Bryce felt suddenly out of place, a drifter pretending to belong. He stood awkwardly near his horse, hat in hand, wondering if he should have come at all. Then he saw her. Delilah was walking toward the church, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, her dark hair arranged more elaborately than he'd seen before. She spotted him and changed course, heading directly to where he stood. "Good morning," she said, her smile genuine and warm. "I'm so glad you came." With those simple words, his anxiety faded. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, a bold gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the townsfolk nearby. "Come sit with me," she offered. "I'll introduce you to people." The service was simple but heartfelt, the small congregation singing hymns with enthusiasm if not perfect pitch. Bryce, who hadn't been inside a church since his mother's funeral, found himself strangely moved by the community's shared faith. Afterward, Delilah introduced him to what seemed like every resident of Springerville, her hand rarely leaving his arm. Some faces he recognized from his earlier time in town, but now they greeted him differently as someone connected to Delilah, someone who might be staying. The dinner that followed was the most pleasant meal Bryce could remember having in years. The hotel restaurant was modest by city standards, but represented the height of dining in Springerville. They sat at a small table by the window, where the afternoon sunlight cast a golden glow over everything. Delilah was animated as she spoke about her students, the progress they were making, her hopes for expanding the school's library. Bryce found himself captivated by her passion for education, so different from anything in his own experience. "You really love teaching, don't you?" he observed as they finished their meal. "I do," she admitted. "There's something miraculous about watching a child's mind open to new ideas, new possibilities." She paused, then added more softly, "It gives me hope for the future, even out here where life can be so hard." "The children of Springerville are fortunate to have you," Bryce said sincerely. Delilah ducked her head at the compliment, then looked up at him with curious eyes. "What about you, Bryce? What gives you hope?" The question caught him off guard. For so many years, he'd lived day to day, focused on survival and little else. Hope had seemed a luxury he couldn't afford. "I'm not sure I thought much about hope until recently," he admitted. "But lately—" He hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Lately I've been thinking that maybe there's more to life than just moving from place to place, job to job. That maybe having connections to people, to a community, isn't such a bad thing after all." Delilah's eyes softened. "That sounds very much like hope to me." As he walked her home after dinner, the late afternoon sun warming their backs, Bryce felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since childhood. Delilah's small house stood near the schoolhouse, a neat wooden structure with a small garden out front where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom. At her door, they paused, suddenly shy with each other after the ease of their meal together. "Thank you for today," Bryce said. It meant a lot. Delilah smiled up at him. "Will I see you next Sunday?" "If you'd like to." "I would," she said simply. "Very much." Impulsively, Bryce reached for her hand, his now healed fingers wrapping gently around hers. So would I. He wanted to kiss her, realized with sudden clarity how much he wanted it, but hesitated, uncertain of the propriety. Springerville was watching them, he knew, and Delilah's reputation as the schoolteacher was important. As if reading his thoughts, she squeezed his hand once, then released it. "Until next Sunday, then," she said, her eyes telling him that his restraint was appreciated. "Until Sunday," he agreed, placing his hat back on his head and stepping back as she entered her house. The ride back to the Henderson ranch seemed shorter than usual, his mind full of Delilah, her smile, her voice, the feeling of her hand in his. For the first time in years, Bryce Jameson was looking forward to the future. The weeks that followed established a new pattern in Bryce's life: 6 days of hard work at the ranch, followed by the reward of Sundays with Delilah. They attended church together each week, then spent the afternoons exploring their growing connection. Sometimes they ate at the hotel restaurant again. Other times, Delilah packed a simple picnic, and they rode to a quiet spot by the creek that ran east of town, where cottonwood trees provided dappled shade. Once, she invited him to her small house for a home-cooked meal that reminded him of his mother's cooking in ways that brought a lump to his throat. Their courtship progressed with a deliberate slowness that both respected and intensified their growing feelings. Bryce was careful to maintain propriety in public, mindful of Delilah's position in the community. But in private moments, helping her down from her horse, saying goodbye at her door, their touches lingered longer, their gazes held more meaning. 3 weeks after their first Sunday together, as they sat beside the creek watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Bryce finally found the courage to express what had been building in his heart. "Delilah," he said, her name still a wonder on his lips. She turned to him, the fading light catching the blue of her eyes. "Yes? I need to tell you something." He took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. "I've spent most of my life moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. It was easier that way. Safer." Delilah listened intently, her face serious. "But since I met you, since that day you tended my hand, something's changed?" He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm not sure exactly what this is between us, but I know it's something I've never felt before, something I don't want to lose by moving on." Her fingers tightened around his. "What are you saying, Bryce?" "I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with you," he admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating. "And I'm asking if you might feel something similar." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Delilah was silent. Then a smile slowly spread across her face, radiant in the gathering dusk. "I do," she whispered. "I've tried to be sensible, to remind myself that you might leave at any time. But the truth is, I started falling for you from the moment you let me tend your wounds. Your hands told me more about you than words ever could, the strength in them, the gentleness you tried to hide, the way you endured pain without complaint." Relief and joy surged through Bryce in equal measure. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, "not unless you ask me to." "I won't," she assured him. With infinite care, Bryce raised his hand to her cheek, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her face. When he leaned forward, she met him halfway, their first kiss gentle and sweet in the fading light. It was a beginning. As spring turned to summer, Bryce and Delilah's courtship became the talk of Springerville. Most regarded it with approval. The hard-working cowboy and the beloved schoolteacher made a handsome couple. And Bryce's steady employment at the Henderson Ranch had established him as a respectable member of the community. There were exceptions, of course. Amos Peterson, the bank manager's son, who had harbored hopes of winning Delilah's affections himself, watched their Sunday walks with barely concealed resentment. And some of the older matrons of the town still viewed Bryce as an outsider, though his regular church attendance and obvious devotion to Delilah were slowly winning them over. For Bryce, these months were a revelation. The stability of life in one place, the growing connections to people beyond just Delilah, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself, all of it was new and sometimes overwhelming. but he found himself thriving in ways he'd never expected. His natural reticence gradually giving way to cautious integration into the community. One hot July evening, as they sat on the porch of Delilah's small house sharing a pitcher of lemonade, Bryce broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been saving my wages," he said, watching a hummingbird flit among the flowers Delilah had planted that spring. "Henderson's been generous, and there's not much to spend money on out at the ranch." "That's wise," Delilah commented. "It's good to have savings for the future." Bryce nodded, gathering his courage. "I've been thinking about that future, about what I want it to look like." He turned to face her directly. "About who I want to share it with." Delilah set her glass down, her eyes wide as she realized where the conversation was heading. "I know we haven't known each other that long," Bryce continued, "just a few months, and I don't have much to offer except my hands and my heart. But I love you, Delilah. I love you in a way I didn't know was possible." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden container he'd carved himself during evening hours at the ranch, but inside was a ring with a modest sapphire that had cost him nearly all his savings. "I'm asking if you'd do me the honor of becoming my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "Not right away, if you need time, but someday, when you're ready." Tears welled in Delilah's eyes, catching the golden light of the setting sun. "Bryce," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't need time. I've known since that day by the creek that you're the man I want to spend my life with." She reached for the box with trembling fingers. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. Whenever you want." Bryce slipped the ring onto her finger, his own hands steady now, healed completely from the wounds that had first brought them together. When he kissed her, it was with all the promise of the future they would build together. They agreed on an October wedding, when the worst heat of summer would have passed, but before the winter chill set in. Delilah wanted time to write to her brother in San Francisco, hoping he might make the journey to give her away. Bryce, with no family of his own, found himself unexpectedly adopted by the Hendersons, who insisted on hosting the wedding at their ranch. The months of preparation flew by in a blur of happiness for Bryce. He continued his work at the ranch with renewed purpose, impressing Thomas Henderson so much that the older man offered him a promotion to foreman, with a corresponding increase in wages and responsibility. "You've got a good head for the business," Henderson told him one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch, reviewing cattle counts. "And the men respect you. That's rare in someone your age." "Thank you, sir," Bryce replied, genuinely touched by the confidence. Henderson took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "Been thinking about the future of this place. My sons both took to city life. One's a lawyer in Denver, the other's in banking in Tucson. Neither has any interest in ranching." Bryce listened, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Martha and I aren't getting any younger," Henderson continued. "This broken leg was a wake-up call. Won't be able to manage the physical demands of the ranch indefinitely." He fixed Bryce with a direct gaze. "What would you think about becoming a partner in the operation? Not right away, but working toward it over the next few years?" The offer was so unexpected that Bryce was momentarily speechless. That's extremely generous, Mr. Henderson. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," the older man replied. "Talk it over with your bride-to-be. It would mean a real future here, Bryce, a chance to build something lasting." That night, as Bryce lay in his bunk in the ranch hand's quarters, sleep eluded him. The trajectory of his life had changed so dramatically in just a few months that he sometimes felt he was dreaming. From a drifting cowboy with no ties to anyone, he had become a man with a fiancée he adored, a respected position, and now the prospect of a partnership in a successful ranch, all because he'd gotten into a fistfight over a card game and let a woman tend his wounded hands. The next day was Sunday, and as always, Bryce rode into town for church and to spend the day with Delilah. He found her waiting on the steps of her house, her face lighting up at the sight of him as it always did. After church, As they walked toward the creek for a picnic, he told her about Henderson's offer. "A partnership?" Delilah repeated, her eyes wide with surprise. "Bryce, that's wonderful. What an opportunity." "It would mean staying in Springerville," he said, watching her face carefully. "Putting down real roots here. Is that something you'd want?" She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Is that even a question? I love Springerville. My work is here, my students, the community that's become like family to me." She took his hands in hers. "And now the man I love would have a chance to build something lasting here too. It's more than I ever dared hope for." Relief flooded through him. "I wanted to be sure. I know you came from a different kind of life in Boston. Sometimes I worry that all this," he gestured at the rugged landscape around them, "isn't enough for you." Delilah's expression softened. "Oh, Bryce, this life, this place, it's everything I want. I chose Springerville long before I met you. Remember? The fact that I found you here too just makes it all the more perfect." He pulled her close then, mindful that they were still within sight of town, but needing to hold her just the same. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, "and I'm going to accept Henderson's offer." As summer faded into early autumn, wedding preparations accelerated. Delilah received word that her brother Daniel would indeed make the journey from San Francisco to give her away, news that brought her to tears of joy when she shared it with Bryce. The town of Springerville embraced the upcoming nuptials with enthusiasm. The women organized sewing circles to help create Delilah's wedding dress, while the men planned to build a small house for the couple on a corner of Henderson Ranch property, close enough for Bryce to oversee operations, but with enough privacy for the newlyweds to start their life together. Even Amos Peterson seemed to have accepted the inevitable, going so far as to offer the services of his father's bank for a home loan, should the couple need it in the future. 2 weeks before the wedding, as Bryce supervised the final construction of their new home, a rider arrived at the Henderson Ranch with news that cast a shadow over their happiness. A band of Apache who had escaped from the San Carlos Reservation were raiding isolated homesteads in the territory. Though they hadn't come near Springerville yet, the territorial governor had requested that all communities be on alert. Thomas Henderson took the news seriously, organizing the ranch hands into guard rotations and ensuring that all weapons were in good repair. In town, a similar vigilance took hold, with the sheriff deputizing several men to augment his usual force. "Should we postpone the wedding?" Delilah asked when Bryce shared the news with her that evening. He shook his head firmly. "No, we've waited long enough, and the Apache are reportedly headed west, away from here. By the time we marry, this will likely be old news." She nodded, trusting his judgment but unable to completely hide her concern. "Just be careful out there, especially at night." "Always," he promised, kissing her softly before mounting his horse for the ride back to the ranch. 3 days later, Bryce's confidence was proven tragically optimistic. A small band of Apache warriors, split off from the main group, attacked a homestead just 15 miles from Springerville. The family, a husband, wife, and 2 young children, had been killed, their home burned to the ground. The news sent a wave of fear through the community. Families from outlying farms and ranches moved into town for safety, and a larger militia was formed. The cheerful preparations for Bryce and Delilah's wedding continued, but now with an undercurrent of tension that was impossible to ignore. "We should postpone," Bryce said grimly, as he and Delilah sat in her small parlor the evening after the news reached them. "It's not right to celebrate while people are in mourning and afraid." Delilah was quiet for a long moment, her face troubled. "Perhaps you're right," she finally conceded. "Though it breaks my heart to think of waiting when we've been planning so carefully." "It won't be for long," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "Just until this danger is past. Your brother can stay with us until then." She nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Promise me you won't join the militia, Bryce. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." The request placed him in an impossible position. As a man of the community, he felt obligated to help protect it. But the fear in Delilah's eyes was real, and the thought of causing her such distress was unbearable. "I'll promise to be careful," he said, choosing his words deliberately, "and to make no rash decisions. But if Henderson asks for my help in defending the ranch, I can't refuse him." Delilah closed her eyes briefly, accepting the compromise. "I understand. Just remember that you have someone waiting for you now, someone who needs you to come back safely." "I'll never forget that," he promised. The next day, as Bryce worked with the other ranch hands to reinforce the perimeter of the Henderson property, a scout rode in with news that the Apache band had been spotted just 10 miles to the east, heading in the direction of Springerville. Henderson immediately sent 2 riders, one to town to warn the sheriff and one to the nearest army outpost, though help from that quarter would take at least 2 days to arrive. "Get the women into the main house," Henderson ordered, his face grim. "Manuel, take them the rifles from the gun cabinet. They'll need to defend themselves if we can't hold the perimeter." Bryce helped organize the defenses, his years of experience on the frontier proving valuable as they positioned men at strategic points around the ranch buildings. There were only 8 of them in total. Henderson himself, despite his still healing leg, Bryce, the Ellis brothers, Manuel, and 3 other ranch hands. "If they come at night, we're at a disadvantage," Henderson said as they finished their preparations. "Apache know how to move silently in the dark." "Let's hope they don't come at all," Bryce replied, though he knew the hope was likely in vain. As darkness fell, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet. Bryce took the first watch with one of the Ellis brothers, their eyes straining to detect movement in the moonlit landscape that surrounded the ranch. 2 hours into their vigil, a flicker of movement caught Bryce's attention at the edge of the corral. He raised his rifle, finger poised near the trigger, and waited. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a coyote trotted into view, its lean form unmistakable in the moonlight. Bryce lowered his weapon, exhaling slowly. "Jumpy, ain't we?" Ellis whispered from his position a few yards away. "Better jumpy than dead," Bryce replied softly. The night wore on without incident, and as dawn broke, a cautious optimism began to take hold. Perhaps the Apache had changed course, heading away from Springerville after all. That hope was shattered mid-morning when a rider from town arrived at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. "The Apache hit the Miller place at dawn," he gasped as Henderson helped him dismount. "Killed Mr. Miller and his oldest boy. Mrs. Miller and the little ones got away. They're in town now. Sheriff's gathering every man who can shoot. Says they're likely to hit another homestead before the day's out." Henderson's face hardened. "How many warriors?" Mrs. Miller counted at least 15 before she ran. A grim silence fell over the gathered men. 15 warriors against the small community of Springerville represented terrible odds, especially with the army still days away. "We need to get to town," Henderson decided. "Join forces with the sheriff. We stand a better chance together than spread out." No one argued. Within 30 minutes, they had loaded the women of the ranch, Mrs. Henderson and the cook, Mrs. Donovan, into the wagon along with essential supplies. The men rode alongside, weapons ready, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. As they approached Springerville, Bryce's thoughts turned to Delilah. The school was at the edge of town, potentially vulnerable to attack. He urged his horse ahead of the group, intending to ensure she was safely inside the more defensible center of the settlement. The schoolhouse came into view, its simple wooden structure standing alone against the backdrop of the Arizona landscape. To Bryce's relief, no children played in the yard. They must have been kept home due to the threat. He dismounted quickly and approached the door, calling out Delilah's name. When no answer came, he pushed the door open, heart racing. The schoolroom was empty, the slate board wiped clean, chairs neatly arranged. No sign of struggle, no indication of what had become of Delilah. Bryce remounted and rode hard for the center of town, fear clawing at his insides. The main street was crowded with people when he arrived, families who had fled their outlying homes, men gathering weapons, women organizing supplies. He spotted the sheriff outside the jailhouse, deep in conversation with several men, including Amos Peterson. "Sheriff," Bryce called, dismounting in a cloud of dust. "Miss O'Brien, have you seen her?" The lawman turned, his weathered face grave. "She's at the hotel, helping organize the women and children there. Schoolhouse was too exposed. I had her bring everyone in this morning." Relief washed over Bryce, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. "Thank you," he managed. "You Henderson's man?" the sheriff asked, recognizing him. "He coming in too?" "Right behind me," Bryce confirmed, "with the rest of the ranch hands." The sheriff nodded. "Good. We need every gun we can get. I've sent riders to the other ranches trying to get everyone into town before dark." Bryce headed for the hotel, weaving through the crowded street. Inside, the normally quiet lobby was transformed into a bustling command center for the town's women. Delilah stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing the organization of food, bedding, and medical supplies. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting with relief. "Bryce!" she exclaimed, hurrying to him. "Thank God you're safe." He embraced her quickly, mindful of the many eyes upon them. "And you. When I found the school empty." "Sheriff Johnson moved us all into town at first light," she explained, "after the news about the Millers." "Smart man," Bryce said, glancing around at the organized chaos of the hotel. "You've got things well in hand here." Delilah's expression turned serious. "What's happening out there? Is it true that 15 warriors are heading this way?" "That's what Mrs. Miller reported," Bryce confirmed. "Henderson and the others are coming into town now. We're going to help defend the settlement." Fear flashed across her face, but she mastered it quickly. "Of course you are," she said steadily. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," he assured her. "And this will all be over soon. The Army's been notified they'll be here in a day or two at most." She nodded, though they both knew that a day or two might be too long if the Apache chose to attack Springerville directly. "I need to get back to the sheriff," Bryce said reluctantly. "Henderson will be arriving any minute." Delilah leaned up and kissed him quickly. Propriety momentarily forgotten in the face of danger. "I love you," she whispered. "Come back to me." "Always," he promised. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparations. The sheriff organized the town's defenders into groups, assigning each to a specific area. Bryce, Henderson, and their men were tasked with guarding the eastern approach to town, where the Apache were most likely to come from if they attacked. By nightfall, Springerville had been transformed into a fortress of sorts. Wagons blocked the main streets, buildings had been reinforced, and armed men patrolled the perimeter. Women and children were gathered in the most defensible buildings, the hotel, the bank, and the church, with armed guards stationed at each. Bryce took his position at the eastern barricade as darkness fell. His Winchester rifle loaded and ready. Beside him, the Ellis brothers maintained a tense silence, their young faces set in grim determination. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, each rustle of wind or distant animal cry sending a jolt of alertness through the waiting defenders. But dawn broke with no sign of the Apache warriors. A cautious optimism began to spread through the town as the morning wore on without incident. Perhaps the Apache had bypassed Springerville altogether, heading for easier targets or moving back toward the mountains where pursuit would be more difficult. By midday, some of the tension had eased, though the vigilance remained. Bryce took advantage of a break in his watch to visit Delilah at the hotel, finding her tired but resolute as she helped distribute food to the displaced families. "Any news?" she asked when she could steal a moment away. "Nothing," Bryce replied, "which could be good or bad. Either they've moved on or they're waiting for us to let our guard down." Delilah nodded, understanding the precarious situation. "The children are frightened," she said quietly. "I've been trying to keep their spirits up with stories and small games, but they sense the adults' fear." Bryce squeezed her hand. "You're good with them. They're fortunate to have you here." Before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Shouts echoed from the direction of the main street, and Bryce instinctively moved Delilah behind him as he approached the hotel entrance. A rider was galloping into town, his horse nearly spent. As he reached the center of the settlement, he called out, "The army! The army's coming!" A cheer went up from the gathered defenders. The rider, one of the scouts the sheriff had sent out the previous day, slid from his horse and continued his report. 2 companies, maybe 100 men. They were already on their way when I met them and heard about the breakout from San Carlos. They'll be here by sunset. Relief spread through the crowd like a wave. With army reinforcements, the threat to Springerville would be effectively neutralized. Bryce turned to Delilah, a smile breaking across his face. "It's over," he said. "By tomorrow, everything will be back to normal." She returned his smile, though a shadow of concern lingered in her eyes. "I hope so," she said. "I won't feel truly safe until those warriors are captured or driven far from here." Her caution proved prescient. As the afternoon waned and the community's vigilance inevitably relaxed in anticipation of the army's arrival, the attack came swift and brutal from the northwestern edge of town, the direction least expected. The first warning was a flaming arrow that arched high into the sky before plunging onto the dry shingled roof of the livery stable. Within moments, the structure was ablaze, horses screaming in panic as smoke billowed into the late afternoon sky. The diversionary tactic worked exactly as intended. As men rushed to free the horses and fight the fire, Apache warriors slipped into town from multiple directions, their war cries suddenly filling the air. Bryce was halfway to his assigned position when the attack began. He changed course immediately, heading for the hotel where Delilah and many of the women and children were sheltered. Gunfire erupted throughout the town, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns. An Apache warrior appeared in Bryce's path, painted for war and wielding a knife. Bryce fired without hesitation, the warrior falling to the dusty street. He reached the hotel to find 2 men already defending its entrance, exchanging fire with warriors who had taken cover behind an overturned wagon across the street. "Get inside," one of the defenders shouted to Bryce. "They tried to break in through the back. Anderson's there, but he's alone." Bryce nodded and circled the building, rifle ready. Behind the hotel, he found the back door, splintered but still holding, and a middle-aged man he recognized as Anderson, the blacksmith, crouched behind a water barrel, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. "How many?" Bryce asked, taking position beside him. 3, maybe 4, Anderson grunted. "They pulled back when I shot one, but they'll be back." As if summoned by his words, a warrior appeared at the corner of the adjacent building, firing a stolen rifle. The bullet splintered the wood of the water barrel inches from Bryce's head. He returned fire, forcing the warrior back into cover. For several minutes, a tense standoff ensued, neither side able to gain an advantage. Then, from inside the hotel, a woman's scream pierced the air. "They're inside," Anderson realized with horror. "Must have found another way in." Without hesitation, Bryce rose and charged the door, slamming his shoulder against the damaged wood. It gave way on the second impact, and he stumbled into the hotel's back hallway, rifle raised. The interior was chaos. Women were herding children toward the relative safety of the kitchen, while a few men engaged in close-quarters combat with the Apache warriors who had somehow gained entry through a window. Bryce's eyes sought Delilah among the fleeing figures, and found her shepherding 2 small girls toward the kitchen. As he watched, a warrior broke away from the fighting and moved toward her, knife raised. "Delilah!" Bryce shouted, raising his rifle. But in the crowded, chaotic space, he couldn't risk a shot without endangering the women and children. Instead, he dropped his rifle and charged, tackling the warrior just as he reached for Delilah. They crashed to the floor, the warrior's knife slicing through the air, inches from Bryce's face. He caught the man's wrist, straining to keep the blade away from his throat. The Apache was strong, his muscles hardened by a lifetime of survival in the harsh desert. Slowly, inexorably, he forced the knife closer to Bryce's neck. In desperation, Bryce drove his knee up into the warrior's side and twisted violently, reversing their positions. The knife clattered to the floor as they grappled, each seeking advantage. The warrior's hand found Bryce's throat, squeezing with terrible strength. Spots danced before his eyes as his lungs screamed for air. With the last of his strength, he groped blindly for the fallen knife. His fingers closed around the handle just as consciousness began to fade. With a final surge of effort, he drove the blade into the warrior's side. The pressure on his throat released immediately. The warrior jerked once, then went still, dark eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. Bryce rolled away, gasping for breath. As his vision cleared, he saw Delilah kneeling beside him, her face white with fear. "Are you hurt?" she asked, hands moving over him, searching for injuries. He shook his head, still unable to speak. Around them, the sounds of fighting were changing, becoming more distant, less intense. From outside, a new sound arose, the rhythmic beat of drums and the clear carrying notes of a bugle. The army had arrived. The Apache warriors, realizing they were now hopelessly outnumbered, began to withdraw, melting away into the gathering dusk as quickly as they had appeared. Within 20 minutes, the attack was over. Springerville had survived, though not without cost. 4 townspeople were dead, including one of the Ellis brothers who had stood watch with Bryce the night before. A dozen more were wounded, some seriously. The army quickly established order, setting up a perimeter around the town and sending out patrols to pursue the fleeing Apache. The commanding officer, a Colonel Hargrove, assured the community that his men would remain until the threat was completely neutralized. As night fell, Bryce and Delilah sat together on the steps of the hotel, exhaustion etched in every line of their bodies. The street before them was illuminated by lanterns and the still smoldering ruins of the livery stable, where men continued to work to ensure the fire wouldn't spread. "I thought I'd lost you," Delilah said softly, her head resting against Bryce's shoulder. "When I saw you fighting that warrior." He tightened his arm around her. "Takes more than that to keep me from you." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't want to wait any longer to be married. Life is too uncertain, too fragile." Bryce turned to look at her, surprised. "You still want to go ahead with the wedding, even with all this?" "Especially with all this," she said firmly. "Today showed me that we never know what tomorrow might bring. I don't want to waste another day not being your wife." A surge of love washed through him, so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. When he found his voice again, it was rough with emotion. "Then we'll be married as soon as things calm down. No more waiting." 2 weeks later, on a crisp October day with the aspens turning gold in the distant mountains, Bryce Jameson and Delilah O'Brien were married at the Henderson Ranch as originally planned. The wounds of the Apache attack were still fresh, the new graves in the Springerville cemetery, a somber reminder of what had been lost. But life continued, as it always did on the frontier, with resilience and determination. The army had tracked down and captured most of the renegade band, returning them to the San Carlos reservation. Colonel Hargrove had left a detachment of soldiers in Springerville as a precaution, but the immediate danger had passed. Delilah's brother Daniel had arrived from San Francisco just in time for the wedding, having been delayed by the disruption to travel caused by the Apache uprising. He was a tall, scholarly man whose obvious affection for his sister endeared him immediately to Bryce. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. Delilah wore a dress of ivory satin that the women of Springerville had finished in record time, determined that their beloved teacher would have the wedding she deserved. Bryce, in a new suit purchased with his ranch wages, felt both terrified and exultant as he watched her walk toward him on her brother's arm. The small house Bryce had helped build on the Henderson property was ready for them, furnished modestly but comfortably with a combination of purchases and gifts from the community. Delilah would continue teaching at the school in town, riding in each morning with Bryce when he went to work. As they stood before the preacher, hands joined, Bryce was struck by the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a brawl over cards to a love that had survived violence and danger, from torn hands that needed healing to the gentle touch that had mended more than just physical wounds. "I, Bryce, take you, Delilah, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, the words both a vow and a thanksgiving. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Delilah's eyes shone with unshed tears as she repeated the same promise, her voice clear and strong. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Bryce kissed her with all the love and gratitude that filled his heart. The celebration that followed was joyous, despite or perhaps because of the recent hardship the community had endured. There was food and music and dancing, laughter that drove away the shadows of fear that had hung over Springerville for those tense days. As evening fell and the party continued by lantern light, Bryce and Delilah slipped away to the privacy of their new home. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, they stood in the center of the main room, suddenly shy with each other despite all they had shared. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jameson," Bryce said softly, taking her hands in his. Delilah smiled, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "It's perfect," she whispered, looking around at the simple furnishings, the curtains she had sewn herself, the braided rug before the fireplace. "It's just a beginning," Bryce replied. "I plan to build you something grander someday, when the partnership with Henderson is established." She stepped closer, placing her hand against his cheek. "This is all I need, you and me together. Everything else is just extra." He turned his head to kiss her palm, marveling at the softness of her skin against his lips. "I love you," he said simply. "Show me," she whispered. And he did, with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them since that first day when she had taken his torn hands in hers and begun the healing that had led them here. In the years that followed, Bryce and Delilah Jameson became pillars of the Springerville community. The partnership with Thomas Henderson flourished, eventually leading to Bryce taking over management of the ranch when Henderson's health began to fail. Under his direction, the operation expanded, incorporating new breeding techniques and modern ranching methods learned from agricultural journals that Delilah ordered from back east. Their family grew as well. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Henderson, was born a year after their wedding. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, Michael, 2 years after that. The children thrived in the healthy Arizona air, growing strong and smart under their parents' loving guidance. Delilah continued teaching for several years, eventually helping to establish a proper school building to replace the one-room structure where she had started. When the youngest child was old enough, she returned to the classroom, now as the head teacher, supervising 2 younger women who had come west seeking the same opportunities she had found. Bryce's hands, once torn and damaged from violence, became known throughout the territory for their skill with horses and their gentle strength in delivering foals and calves. The scars remained thin white lines across his knuckles, but they faded with time, visible reminders of the twist of fate that had brought him to Delilah. Often, in the quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch of the larger home Bryce had eventually built, they would remember those early days, the care she had taken with his wounds, the silence between them filled with unspoken possibilities, the gradual blooming of love that had transformed both their lives. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gotten into that fight?" Delilah asked one such evening as they watched the sunset paint the Arizona sky in hues of gold and crimson. Bryce considered the question, his hand automatically finding hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "I'd likely have moved on," he admitted, "kept drifting as I always had. Never known what it meant to belong somewhere, to someone." Delilah squeezed his fingers. "And I would have continued waiting for something I couldn't name, some part of myself that was missing. So I suppose," he said with a smile, "that was the most fortunate fistfight in the history of the Arizona territory." She laughed, the sound as dear to him now as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "I wouldn't go that far. But I am grateful every day for whatever series of events, good and bad, brought you to my door with those torn hands." "As am I," Bryce replied, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that had lost none of its meaning over the years. As am I. And as the last light of day faded into the velvet darkness of the desert night, they sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.